Welcome, dear listeners. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon to enjoy more original stories every week. The Inspector Price Mystery Series is a trademarked original, available exclusively on this channel. Settle in, the mystery awaits. Death Among the Masterpieces. Chapter 1. The Gala at Gainesworth Gallery. The Gainesworth Gallery had never looked more splendid, even for a building already admired for its elegant Georgian facade and its tall arched windows. The evening's glow lent it a sense of theatrical grandeur. Gas lamps flickered in the damp London mist, their light dancing off the polished brass handles of the heavy oak doors. Inside, the warm hum of cultured voices floated above the gentle strains of a string quartet hidden discreetly in the far corner. Inspector Harold Price stood just beyond the entrance hall, momentarily forgotten by the tide of glittering guests sweeping past him. Price was no stranger to London's more refined circles. Scotland Yard had a way of depositing him into drawing rooms, embassies and gentlemen's clubs, but art galas were hardly his natural habitat. He felt conspicuous among the sea of silk gowns, opera cloaks, and black-tailored evening coats. Still, the invitation had come directly from Sir Lawrence Gainsworth himself, and one did not easily decline such a man. Sir Lawrence, silver-haired and broad-shouldered despite his advancing years, was moving from group to group with the ease of a man accustomed to admiration. His voice carried over the clink of champagne glasses as he spoke about the night's pièce de résistance, a recently acquired Madonna and Child, believed to be by the hand of Filippo Lippi himself. Restored to her original glory, he announced to one knot of guests, his hands spread wide, by none other than Julian Harcourt, our chief restorer, a genius in his craft. At the mention of Harcourt's name, a tall, angular man in a dark frock coat appeared in the doorway of the adjoining gallery room. He was perhaps in his late 40s, with an aquiline nose and a face worn into lines of habitual seriousness. Harcourt nodded briefly to the crowd, though his eyes seemed to search for someone. Price noted the subtle shift in atmosphere as Harcourt approached Sir Lawrence. The host's genial smile tightened. Harcourt's steps slowed. They exchanged a few words, inaudible under the quartet's lilting music, but the inspector's trained eye caught the quick flash of irritation in Sir Lawrence's face, and the curt way Harcourt's lips pressed together before he moved away. The inspector drifted into the main gallery, letting his gaze take in the grand display. Marble pillars stood like sentinels between alcoves hung with oils, their gilt frames glowing in the lamplight. The Madonna and Child occupied pride of place at the far end, beneath a skylight now covered against the winter night. Even among the masterworks surrounding it, the painting commanded attention. There was a softness in the Virgin's eyes, a delicacy in the curve of the child's hand, that seemed almost to breathe life. As he stood contemplating the painting, a soft voice beside him murmured, "It's remarkable how beauty can hide so many flaws." Price turned to see a woman in a deep green gown, her auburn hair arranged in an artful sweep over one shoulder. Her gloved fingers traced the rim of her champagne glass, but her gaze remained fixed on the Lippi. "Evelyn Harcourt," she introduced herself, without waiting for his inquiry. "Julian's wife. You're Inspector Price, aren't you?" He inclined his head. "We've not met, Mrs. Harcourt. Your husband's work is quite impeccable," she said with a slight arch of her brow. "Yes, he does take pride in perfection." She sipped her champagne. "Perhaps too much pride. It makes him difficult." Before Price could respond, a sudden burst of applause signalled that Sir Lawrence was ready to speak again. Guests gathered as the host stepped onto a small dais. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "tonight is not merely an exhibition, but a celebration of art's eternal voice. These masterpieces have survived centuries, wars, neglect, and now stand before us in their rightful splendour. And so," he lifted his glass, "to Julian Harcourt, whose skill has made this possible." Polite applause followed, though Price noted that Harcourt, leaning against a pillar at the edge of the crowd, did not smile. Nor did Lord Anthony Blackwell, the reclusive collector Price recognised from newspaper sketches. The man stood half in shadow, his eyes locked on the Madonna and Child, as though willing it into his possession. The speeches ended, the quartet struck up a livelier waltz, and waiters circulated with silver trays of hors d'oeuvres. Price made small talk with a few acquaintances, yet stayed observant. More than once he caught Clara Winslow, Sir Lawrence's secretary, slipping in and out of the side rooms with a purposeful air. And on the mezzanine above, Dr. Bernard Keating watched the crowd with an oddly calculating expression, making no attempt to disguise his interest in the guests' movements. By 11 o'clock, the gala was in full swing, and the inspector was almost persuaded that his unease was unfounded. But as he prepared to leave, he glanced toward the far corridor leading to the private restoration rooms. Harcourt was there again, speaking in low, urgent tones to a figure cloaked in black. The light caught a glint of gold in the stranger's hand, perhaps a key, perhaps something else, and then, in a flash, they vanished through a side door. Price's brow furrowed. He told himself it was none of his concern. After all, he was here merely as a guest. Yet as he stepped out into the misty London night, the image of that cloaked figure lingered in his mind like a shadow in the corner of a painting, faint but impossible to ignore. Chapter 2. A shocking discovery. The morning after the gala dawned grey and reluctant, the London sky pressing low and heavy over the city. Inspector Harold Price was midway through a solitary breakfast, tea gone lukewarm, eggs congealing on the plate, when the telephone on the hall table rang. He listened without interruption as the voice on the other end relayed the news. Found this morning, Mr. Harcourt, quite dead, came the clipped phrases, punctuated by a rustle of paper and the muffled sounds of commotion in the background. Sir Lawrence insists. You personally, Inspector, before the press gets wind. By the time the receiver clicked back into place, Price was already reaching for his coat and bowler hat. The Gainesworth Gallery was almost unrecognisable from the glittering ballroom of the previous night. The doors were shut to the public, and 2 uniformed constables stood guard on the front steps, their breath fogging in the chill air. Price was met by Sergeant Wilkes, a solid, dependable man whose expression was unusually grim. "It's in the private viewing room, sir," Wilkes said quietly, leading the way past the main gallery. "Cleaner found him when she came in at 7. Door was locked from the inside." "From the inside?" Price's brow furrowed. "Yes, sir. We had to force it. No sign of anyone else, though the place looks... well, you'll see." They stopped before a heavy oak door at the far end of a narrow corridor. The faint smell of turpentine and varnish lingered in the air. Inside, the private viewing room was smaller and more intimate than the grand hall, its walls hung with pieces awaiting restoration or appraisal. A large easel stood near the centre, a half-finished portrait propped against it. An elegant woman in a crimson gown, her features still hazy in the unfinished brushwork. Julian Harcourt lay slumped on the floor beside the easel, one arm flung out awkwardly, the other curled beneath him as though he had tried and failed to rise. A dark, sticky patch matted the hair just above his left ear. Price knelt, his eyes scanning the scene. The restorer's white shirt was streaked with a smear of gold paint along the cuff. Price noted it immediately. It was fresh, still tacky, and in a shade far brighter than any gold in the unfinished portrait. On the floor nearby lay a small palette knife, its handle splintered, though no blood marked its edge. "Nothing appears stolen," Wilkes offered. "But there's this." He gestured toward a wooden stool against the wall. A sheet of thick drawing paper rested there, covered in neat, meticulous pencil sketches, close-up studies of the Madonna and Child. But in the corner of one page, faint but unmistakable, were initials, C.W.P., that did not belong to Filippo Lippi. Price turned the sheet over in his hands. "And who, pray, is C.W.?" he murmured. "Miss Clara Winslow," Wilkes supplied. "Sir Lawrence's secretary. She's here this morning. Says she came in early to prepare for a buyer visiting tomorrow." Price stood, casting his gaze around the room again. A teacup sat on a side table, the dregs cold, and beside it, a single cigarette end crushed in a saucer. Harcourt, from what Price recalled, did not smoke. Sir Lawrence Gainesworth appeared in the doorway then, looking altogether less composed than the night before. His usually ruddy face was pale, his hair slightly disordered. "Inspector, this is a tragedy, an utter tragedy. Julian was, well, difficult, but brilliant. I can't fathom why anyone would," Price cut in gently. "Who had access to this room after the gala last night?" "Only Julian, myself and Miss Winslow," Sir Lawrence said promptly. "The viewing room remains locked otherwise. The key is kept in my study." He hesitated, then added, "Though Dr. Keating might have borrowed it at times for research. And of course the night watchman patrols these corridors." "And Lord Anthony Blackwell?" Price asked casually. Sir Lawrence's mouth tightened. "Blackwell has no business here beyond the public exhibitions. Frankly, I don't encourage his visits." One by one the inspector began speaking with the morning's occupants of the gallery. Evelyn Harcourt arrived in a flurry of dark skirts and veils, her green eyes flashing with a mixture of grief and bitterness. "Julian had enemies, Inspector," she said without preamble. "He was restoring more than paintings. He was restoring reputations. Sometimes that meant unearthing truths people would rather keep hidden." Clara Winslow, neat in her navy skirt and white blouse, seemed more shaken than grief-stricken. She admitted that she had seen Harcourt after most guests had left the gala. "He asked me for some files from the archives. I delivered them to this room, but I left at once. He was not in the mood for conversation." Dr. Bernard Keating arrived late, smelling faintly of brandy and wearing a look of mock sorrow. "An irreplaceable loss," he intoned. But when Price asked where he had been between midnight and dawn, the historian's answer was vague, his gaze flicking to the unfinished portrait more than once. When the formalities were done, Price returned to the body, his mind already weaving threads together. A locked room, a smear of gold paint, unexplained initials on a restoration sketch, and a man who had been alive and tense less than 12 hours earlier, now lying cold beneath an unfinished work of art. "Hey!" He straightened and slipped the sheet of sketches into an evidence folder. "Sergeant," he said quietly, "keep everyone here until I've spoken to them again. This isn't just murder. There's something else. Something Harcourt stumbled upon last night, and I intend to find out exactly what it was." Chapter 3. A Web of Motives. Inspector Harold Price had always believed that art galleries, with their hushed air and polite order, could be just as treacherous as any back alley in London. Beauty, he knew, had a way of drawing out human greed and vanity in equal measure. And here, beneath the Gainesworth Gallery's serene marble columns, he could already sense the competing currents of ambition, resentment, and fear swirling among its inhabitants. Price had gathered the principal figures into the main gallery, each seated on a velvet bench or pacing restlessly beneath the watchful eyes of centuries-old portraits. He intended to speak to them one by one, but not before observing them together. The subtle shifts of expression, the glances stolen when they thought no one noticed, these often told more than words. Evelyn Harcourt sat with her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap, a woman determined not to let grief untidy her composure. Yet her eyes betrayed her. When Price finally approached, she met his gaze with the poise of someone accustomed to polite society, and perhaps to defending herself against gossip. "My husband was not an easy man, Inspector," she began, before he could ask a question. "Julian demanded perfection in everything. It made him a brilliant restorer, but an impossible companion. His work consumed him. There was no room for anything else. Not for me, not for friends." "And yet," Price said gently, "you were at the gala last night." Her mouth twitched in something that was almost a smile. "Oh, I attend these things for appearances. My presence at Sir Lawrence's events keeps tongues from wagging." Her gaze wandered toward the Madonna and Child hanging nearby. Julian spoke of that piece in hushed tones, as though it were holy, but he also hinted that it might hold secrets. He never told me what he meant. When Price asked where she'd gone after leaving the gala, she hesitated, just a fraction, too long, before answering. Home. Directly home. Alone. Next, Price approached Lord Anthony Blackwell. If Evelyn carried her grief like a fine cloak, Lord Anthony Blackwell wore his disdain like armour. He was a tall, hawk-nosed man in his early 60s, his dark overcoat hanging from narrow shoulders like a robe of state. I had no quarrel with Harcourt, Blackwell said, in a voice that was perfectly even, almost bored. My interest is in the art, not the man. And if I happen to believe that Sir Lawrence overpaid for his latest acquisition, that is my opinion to hold. Price studied him. Rumour has it you made an offer for the Madonna and Child yourself. Blackwell's thin lips curved faintly. An offer that was declined, which only makes me question Sir Lawrence's business sense. I know it's worth better than anyone here. And last night? I left before midnight. I have no patience for speeches and sentimental toasts. I have my own gallery at home, Inspector, one that does not require champagne and flattery to be appreciated. Price noted the man's cool detachment, but also the way his eyes, sharp and acquisitive, kept returning to the paintings on the wall as though mentally cataloguing their value. Next was Clara Winslow. She was perhaps the most visibly unsettled of the group. Her hands fidgeted with the clasp of her handbag, and her eyes darted often towards Sir Lawrence, as if seeking reassurance. She was a handsome woman in her mid-30s, neat as a pin in her navy skirt and high-collared blouse. "You brought Harcourt some files last night," Price began. "Yes," she said quickly. "He wanted documentation on the Madonna and Child, provenance records, shipping manifests from Italy, and the photographs from before restoration. I fetched them from the archives and delivered them to the private viewing room. Then I left. He seemed distracted, preoccupied." Price took a folded sheet from his pocket, the one bearing the initials CW in the corner. "Do you recognise this?" Her eyes widened. "That's my handwriting. I make sketches for reference when cataloguing pieces, but I never sign a restoration. That's Julian's realm. Why he would keep my study among his restoration notes, I can't imagine." The inspector's mind filed away her reaction. It seemed genuine, but that did not rule her out. Price then approached Dr. Bernard Keating. "A ghastly business," Keating said, shaking his head. "Julian was particular. Not everyone could tolerate him, but he was no fool." "You knew him well?" Price asked. "Professionally. I've consulted on several pieces for Sir Lawrence. Occasionally Julian would seek my opinion on attributions. Sometimes we agreed." A faint smile. "Sometimes not." "Where were you after the gala?" "At my club, the Athenaeum. Several of my colleagues can vouch for me." He gave the answer too smoothly, as if anticipating the question. "And did you ever have access to the key to the viewing room?" Keating's eyes gleamed. "Sir Lawrence occasionally entrusted me with it, yes, purely for scholarly purposes. But last night, no, I had no reason to visit." Price saved the host for last. Sir Lawrence was pacing the length of the room, his agitation poorly concealed. "This will ruin the gallery," he muttered when Price joined him. "The papers will have a field day. First they'll talk of the murder, then they'll whisper about the authenticity of my collection." "You mentioned Dr. Keating had the key at times. Anyone else?" "Only Julian and Miss Winslow. Blackwell has no business here beyond public openings. I can't imagine who would want Julian dead." Price regarded him steadily. "I think someone here knows exactly why Harcourt was killed, and I suspect it has less to do with the man himself, and more to do with what he discovered." When Price finally stepped away from the group, he felt the first real threads of the tapestry forming in his mind. Each had a connection to Harcourt. Each had something to lose or gain by his death. But one fact stood out like a bold stroke of paint on a delicate canvas. Harcourt had been working late, alone, on a painting that had already been restored. Why? Until Price knew the answer, the murderer, polished, polite, and very possibly seated just a few feet away, would remain hidden among the masterpieces. Chapter 4: Secrets in the Brushstrokes. That afternoon, Inspector Price stood in the private viewing room once more, the air thick with the mingled scents of linseed oil, turpentine, and varnish. Harcourt's body had been removed hours earlier, yet the sense of his presence lingered. Price had seen many murders in his career, but this one carried an unusual weight, not only for the loss of life, but for the feeling that the room itself was part of the crime scene in a far broader sense. The paintings here were silent witnesses, and he intended to make them speak. Price decided to examine the portrait. The unfinished painting, an elegant woman in a crimson gown, drew his attention first. Harcourt had rendered the dress in rich folds of colour, but the face was still little more than a ghostly outline. Up close, Price could see faint traces of a different set of features beneath the current sketch, as if the portrait had begun as someone else entirely before being painted over. He reached for a magnifying lens lying on the work table. Through it, the layers became more distinct, delicate strokes in muted earth tones beneath the bold reds, tiny flakes where the top layer had cracked to reveal an older image. It was not uncommon for artists to reuse canvases, but in the realm of fine art restoration, such revelations could be ruinous or immensely profitable, depending on who controlled the knowledge. Leaving the portrait, Price crossed to the main gallery, where the Madonna and Child still hung in its place of honour. The painting glowed softly under the lamps, the Virgin's eyes gentle, the Child's hand raised in a blessing that seemed almost alive. Yet Price could not shake the feeling that Harcourt's obsession with this work had been the key to everything. He motioned to Sergeant Wilkes, who had been quietly taking notes nearby. "Have we the pre-restoration photographs Miss Winslow delivered to Harcourt?" "Yes, sir." Wilkes produced a slim folder. The inspector laid the photographs on a side table and studied them, comparing each to the painting itself. In the earlier images, the colours were darker, the varnish clouded with age, but there was something else, something subtle in the placement of the child's fingers. In the restored version, the angle of the hand was slightly different. The smallest finger bent inward in a way it had not been before. It was a minute alteration, almost imperceptible, unless one had reason to look for it. Price leaned closer to the painting, his eyes narrowing. At the edge of the gilded frame, near the Virgin's robe, there was the faintest suggestion of initials, so faint they might easily be dismissed as a quirk of the brush. He stepped back, then forward again, changing his angle. Yes, 2 letters, skillfully blended into the folds of the robe, C.W. Clara Winslow. If the initials were truly hers, the implication was troubling. No restorer, however junior, would insert their own mark into a Renaissance master's work unless the work itself was not entirely what it seemed. Was it possible the Madonna and Child was a forgery, or at least partly so, and that Harcourt had uncovered the truth? He was still studying the piece when Sir Lawrence Gainesworth entered, his shoes clicking smartly on the parquet. "Inspector, you seem entirely absorbed. May I assist in any way?" "Perhaps," Price replied without looking away. "Did you authorise Miss Winslow to contribute to the restoration of this piece?" Sir Lawrence frowned. "No, certainly not. Julian was quite territorial about his work. Clara's duties are clerical and administrative, though she's a competent sketch artist." "Why?" Price only gave a faint smile. "Curiosity, Sir Lawrence, a professional habit." Gainesworth studied him a moment longer before retreating, his footsteps brisk. Back in the private viewing room, Price sifted through the work table's drawers. In the bottom one, beneath a pile of invoices and correspondence, he found a small, leather-bound ledger. The pages were filled in Harcourt's careful, slanted script, detailing restoration steps, pigments used, and varnish layers for various works. Halfway through, a section caught Price's attention, a list of dates and times that did not correspond to any known exhibition or restoration schedule. Beside each date was a cryptic notation: MC swap, BK visit after hours, CW present. The last entry was from the night before. Final check, Madonna, truth confirmed. Price closed the ledger slowly, his mind turning. Truth confirmed. Whatever Harcourt had discovered, it had been conclusive enough to warrant recording and dangerous enough to get him killed. As he emerged into the corridor, he nearly collided with a young man carrying a bundle of dust sheets. The boy, barely out of his teens, looked startled. "Beg pardon, sir?" Price studied him. "You were here last night?" "Yes, sir. I'm Alfred, junior assistant. I help with closing up after events." "Did you see Mr. Harcourt after the gala ended?" Alfred shifted nervously. "I saw him talking to someone, sir, in the corridor by the side entrance. The person was wearing a long black cloak. Couldn't see their face, but they dropped something." "And?" The boy reached into his pocket and produced a small brass key, worn smooth with use. "I didn't know what to do with it, sir. Thought it might be important." Price took the key, weighing it in his palm. It was not the gallery's front door key. He knew that at once. This was smaller, more delicate, likely for a private cabinet or perhaps a vault. As the afternoon light faded into the dim glow of early evening, Price pored over his notes again. The smear of gold paint, the altered details in the Madonna and Child, the initials, the ledger, and now the mysterious key. They were all pieces of the same puzzle. Somewhere within the walls of the Gainesworth Gallery, the truth waited to be uncovered. Chapter 5. Whispers in the Hallways. By the time Inspector Harold Price began his evening round of questioning, the Gainesworth Gallery had fallen into that peculiar hush that comes when the day's bustle has ended, but the lights have yet to be dimmed. Price liked this hour. It was when the veneer of civility often slipped, when people, tired and unsettled, let things show in their eyes or their tone that they might have guarded more carefully in the bright light of morning. He strolled the length of the east corridor, where the scent of fresh polish still clung to the parquet flooring. Here and there, the gas lamps glowed in small pools of light, casting the paintings in alternating swaths of gold and shadow. Somewhere far off, a clock chimed 7, its sound carrying faintly through the halls. From behind a partly opened door came the murmur of voices. Price slowed his step, moving just close enough to catch the cadence of conversation without revealing his presence. "I told you, it's too dangerous now," a woman's voice whispered sharply. "And I told you," came a man's lower clipped reply. "We've gone too far to turn back." The sound of papers being hastily shuffled followed, then the squeak of a drawer. Price eased back a step and waited until the door opened. Clara Winslow emerged, her face pale but composed, clutching a leather folio to her chest. She started at the sight of him. "Inspector, I thought you'd left for the day," she said quickly. "I found myself with a few more questions," Price replied mildly, his eyes taking in the way she kept her grip on the folio. "Were you speaking to someone just now?" Her eyes flickered. "Only Dr. Keating. He wanted to discuss some upcoming acquisitions." "Ah, acquisitions," Price smiled faintly, but his mind noted the tremor in her voice. "If you should recall anything about last night, anything at all, please let me know." Clara gave a short nod and slipped away down the corridor. A turn later, Price found Lord Anthony Blackwell standing alone in the small sculpture gallery, his long fingers idly tracing the base of a marble bust. The man looked up, his expression unreadable. "You seem very much at home here, Lord Blackwell," Price said conversationally. Blackwell's thin smile returned. "Art is the only home worth having, Inspector. These pieces endure. People do not." Did Harcourt share that sentiment? The collector gave a soft, humourless laugh. Harcourt was a craftsman, not a visionary. He lived in service to the work, but he lacked the, shall we say, imagination to understand its greater value. Greater value than artistic merit? Blackwell's eyes glinted. Art's value, Inspector, lies in what people will pay for it. You of all people should know how greed and beauty make such a potent pair. Price let the words hang in the air. Blackwell's candour was striking, but so was his careful avoidance of anything resembling an alibi. In the service corridor near the rear entrance, Price found the night watchman, Mr. Hale, polishing the brass latch of a heavy door. Haley was a wiry man in his late 50s, with the cautious manner of one used to walking dark halls alone. "You were on duty last night?" Price asked. "Aye, sir, from 10 until 6. "Did you see Mr. Harcourt after the gala?" "I did, sir. Around 11:30 I saw him near the side entrance. He was talking with a man, tall, wearing a black cloak. Thought it odd, but I was too far to see his face." Harcourt seemed agitated. "And did they enter the building?" "I believe they did, sir. They went toward the private viewing room. The door closed behind them. After that, I didn't see Harcourt again." Price's eyes narrowed. That made two witnesses, the boy Alfred and the watchman, who had seen a cloaked figure with Harcourt, and both had placed the meeting near the side entrance. Returning to the main gallery, Price paused before a smaller alcove. On the wall hung a painting of a Venetian canal, but the space to its right was conspicuously empty. The frame hook was still in place, and the faint square of unfaded wallpaper suggested that something had recently hung there. He called Wilkes over. "What was here?" Wilkes consulted a small ledger. "A seascape, sir. Fishing boats at dawn. Not one of the more valuable pieces, but it's in the storeroom now." "Why was it removed?" Wilkes frowned. "Not sure, sir. No one logged the change." Price's mind ticked over. A missing painting, however minor, in a gallery already under suspicion for forgery. It was another loose thread to tug. It was nearing 8 when the first sign of real action came. Price was in the main hall when the sharp sound of metal scraping on metal echoed from the west wing. He moved quickly, Wilkes at his side, rounding the corner just in time to see a figure in dark clothing bent over the lock of the small archive room. "Stay where you are," Price's voice rang out. The figure bolted, darting down the narrow hall toward the service exit. Wilkes gave chase, but the intruder knew the building too well, slipping through a side door into the rain-dark street beyond. By the time they reached it, the street was empty. Inside the lock, Price found a broken bit of metal, a fragment of an old key, snapped in the attempt. He compared it to the brass key Alfred had given him earlier. Not the same, which meant there were multiple keys in circulation for restricted areas of the gallery. As the gallery finally fell silent for the night, Price walked once more through the main hall, his gaze lingering on the Madonna and child. The smallest finger on the child's hand bent inward. The initials, faint but deliberate. Harcourt's cryptic ledger entry. Truth confirmed. He was beginning to see it now, not the entire picture, but enough of the outline to know what kind of crime he was chasing. Harcourt had uncovered more than a forgery. He had stumbled upon a calculated operation, one that likely involved more than one person, and had been running under Sir Lawrence's very nose, or perhaps with his quiet consent. But what gnawed at Price was the sense that whoever had killed Harcourt had not finished their work. The break-in tonight proved it. There was still something in the gallery worth stealing, or hiding, and until he found it, Harcourt's death would remain only part of the story. Chapter 6. A Dangerous Game. By the following morning, Inspector Harold Price had decided that subtlety alone would no longer serve him. The killer, whether out of arrogance or desperation, had made one mistake too many with the attempted break-in the night before. It told Price two things. First, that there was still something hidden in the Gainesworth Gallery worth stealing, and second, that his opponent was willing to take considerable risks to obtain it. Price intended to make that risk irresistible. He convened the principal figures in the main gallery just before noon. The setting was deliberate. The vast room with its marble columns, polished parquet, and gleaming frames was the gallery's heart, a place where every word would carry and every glance would be noted. Sir Lawrence Gainesworth stood stiffly by the Madonna and child, as if its beauty might somehow shield him from scandal. Evelyn Harcourt sat to one side, her green eyes coolly appraising the others. Lord Anthony Blackwell prowled near a statue of Apollo, his hands clasped behind his back, like a general surveying a battlefield. Clara Winslow and Dr. Bernard Keating both looked wary, their eyes avoiding each other's. Price allowed a moment of silence to stretch before he began. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his tone almost conversational, "last night there was an unsuccessful attempt to force entry into the gallery archives. Such efforts rarely occur without motive. I believe that Mr. Harcourt left behind something that would expose the very heart of the crime committed here." The shift in the room was subtle but unmistakable, a flicker in Blackwell's eyes, Clara's hand tightening on her handbag, Sir Lawrence's jaw tensing. "I intend," Price went on, "to conduct a demonstration this afternoon in the private viewing room. There, I shall reveal the precise nature of Harcourt's discovery. The press will be invited. If anyone wishes to clarify their position before that time, my office remains at your disposal." He let the words sink in, then dismissed them. Over the next hour, Price moved quietly through the gallery, letting the story of his impending revelation spread like ink through water. Staff members whispered in corners. The rustle of hurried footsteps echoed in the corridors. Price positioned the constables discreetly at key points, one near the service entrance, another by the side door leading to the restoration rooms. It was a calculated gamble. If the killer believed Harcourt had left physical proof, a document perhaps, or a hidden note, then they might try to retrieve or destroy it before Price's demonstration. Shortly after 1 o'clock, Price saw Clara Winslow slip into the private viewing room. He followed at a distance, stopping just outside the doorway. Inside, Clara moved quickly to Harcourt's work table, her fingers rifling through the drawers. She found a folded sheet of paper and read it rapidly before tucking it into her handbag. Price stepped inside. "Looking for something, Miss Winslow?" She spun around, colour rising in her cheeks. Sir Lawrence asked me to retrieve some inventory notes." "Inventory notes or something else?" His eyes rested briefly on her handbag. Her lips tightened. "You're twisting things, Inspector. Julian was a friend. I'm trying to help preserve his reputation." Price said nothing, but he noted her agitation and the defensive edge in her voice. She brushed past him and left, her heels clicking sharply on the floor. At 2:30, Wilkes appeared, his face flushed from haste. "Sir, the cloaked figure's back. Just came through the side entrance." Price moved quickly, keeping to the shadows of the east corridor. Ahead he saw the tall figure, cloaked in black as described before, slip into the restoration rooms. Price and Wilkes followed at a careful distance. From a narrow gap in the doorframe, they watched as the intruder went straight to a locked cabinet in the corner. Producing a small key, the figure opened it and withdrew a slim, flat parcel wrapped in brown paper. The intruder unwrapped it just enough for Price to glimpse a canvas, its paint still fresh, the colours too bright for an antique. A Harmesit Varney. Price stepped into the room. "I think that belongs to the gallery." The figure froze, then turned slowly. It was Dr. Bernard Keating. He regarded Price with a thin, humourless smile. "Inspector, you move quietly for a man of your build." "And you move carelessly for a man with so much to lose," Price replied. Keating placed the parcel carefully back on the table. "You don't understand. Harcourt was about to ruin years of work. The Madonna and Child is not a forgery. It's a masterpiece. Improved. We restored it to what it should have been." Price's eyes hardened. "Improved with your own hand and marked with Miss Winslow's initials?" Keating's smile faltered, but he said nothing. Before Price could press further, Clara appeared in the doorway, pale and breathless. "Bernard, for heaven's sake—" Her voice broke off as she saw the inspector. In that frozen moment, Price read the truth in their faces. Partners in the forgery, each complicit in the other's crime. But the murder, Price was certain, belonged to only one of them. He allowed them to stew in the silence for a heartbeat before speaking. "This parcel will remain in police custody," he said, "and you, Dr. Keating, will remain in this room until I've spoken with you properly." He signalled Wilkes to escort them both under watch. The demonstration, it seemed, would not require any actual press. His real audience had already taken the bait. As the day waned and the gas lamps flared once more in the corridors, Price returned alone to the Madonna and Child. He studied it in the quiet, thinking of Harcourt's final ledger entry. Truth confirmed. The truth, Price knew, was almost in his grasp, but there was still one question that would not leave him. If Keating and Clara were responsible for the forgeries, who had delivered the fatal blow to Julian Harcourt? He suspected the answer was not standing in the restoration room at all. Chapter 7. The Unmasking. Inspector Harold Price had spent enough years in the yard to know that a case could be solved long before the guilty party realised they had lost. The trick, he always said, was to let them keep playing the game until they dealt themselves into checkmate. By the following morning, the Gainesworth Gallery was brimming with tension. Price had arranged to meet all of them in the smaller of the gallery's public rooms, a long, narrow space lined with Dutch seascapes, its polished floor echoing every step. They arrived one by one. Sir Lawrence Gainsworth came first, immaculate in a dark morning coat, but with a harried look in his eyes. Clara Winslow and Dr. Bernard Keating followed together, their earlier defiance dulled into watchfulness. Evelyn Harcourt entered in a cloud of subtle perfume, her mourning veil just sheer enough to let her sharp green eyes observe every move. Lord Anthony Blackwell was last, carrying his habitual air of disdain. Price waited until the door was closed before speaking. "Last night," he began evenly, "I recovered a forged painting from Dr. Keating in the restoration room. It is clear now that Miss Winslow and Dr. Keating were engaged in replacing certain originals with expertly crafted copies. These forgeries were then redistributed, shall we say, to parties willing to pay handsomely for them." Keating's mouth tightened. Clara's eyes remained fixed on the floor. "But forgery, however serious, is not my principal concern," Price continued. "Julian Harcourt was murdered, struck down in the very room where he worked. He discovered the scheme and, in doing so, sealed his fate." Clara spoke, her voice low but urgent. "We didn't kill him. Yes, Julian knew about the copies. He was furious, said he'd go to Sir Lawrence, but Bernard and I left him alive. We thought we might persuade him to see reason." "Reason?" Price echoed. "You mean silence?" Keating gave a bitter laugh. "You're wasting time, Inspector. If you think one of us killed Harcourt, you're wrong. We needed him. His reputation gave our restorations credibility." Price regarded them coolly. "That is precisely why. I believe you're telling the truth. You had motive, but killing him would have been bad business." Price began to pace slowly, his shoes clicking softly on the parquet. Harcourt was dangerous to more than one person in this room. He was a man of principle, and he had an eye that could pierce deception. The night before his death, he met with someone in secret, a person wearing a long black cloak. 2 witnesses saw them near the side entrance. His gaze fell on Sir Lawrence. "You have a cloak, do you not?" Sir Lawrence stiffened. "Yes, but so do half the gentlemen in London. And you have a key to the private viewing room, as does the night watchman. But more to the point, you had the most to lose if Harcourt exposed not only the forgeries, but the true nature of the Madonna and Child." Sir Lawrence's eyes narrowed. "And what true nature is that?" Price's voice remained steady. "That it was never yours to sell or display. You acquired it legitimately, but replaced it with a forgery months ago, selling the original abroad to a private buyer. The forgery was so good that even Keating and Winslow didn't realise they were restoring a copy. Harcourt, however, did realise, and that, Sir Lawrence, is why you met him the night of the gala." A flush rose up Sir Lawrence's neck. This is absurd." "No," Price said quietly, "this is murder. You struck him with the heavy base of the desk lamp in the viewing room, an object conspicuously absent from the crime scene when I first inspected it. You had the opportunity to remove it before raising the alarm. The gold paint on Harcourt's cuff transferred from the lamp's decorative trim." There was a small stunned silence. Evelyn Harcourt's veil shifted as her lips curved in something that might have been satisfaction. Lord Blackwell's eyebrows lifted just a fraction, as though he had finally been shown a painting in the proper light. Sir Lawrence's shoulders sagged. He threatened to ruin me. Years of work of building this collection, gone in a moment. I did what I thought was necessary. What was necessary, Price said, was to face the consequences of your greed. Instead, you added murder to your ledger. Wilkes stepped forward at Price's signal. Sir Lawrence straightened his coat, his expression a careful mask once more. The art world will remember me, Inspector. Scandal fades, but legacy endures. Price's reply was quiet but certain. Not when it's painted in blood. As Sir Lawrence was led away, Price turned to Keating and Clara. Your part in this will be dealt with in due course, but make no mistake, the Yard will be examining every acquisition in this gallery. Yet even as the room emptied, Price remained by the door, frowning slightly. The case had broken cleanly, the confession obtained, and still he felt the faint tug of something unfinished. In Harcourt's final ledger entry, truth confirmed, there might have been more than one truth, and that he knew would be the subject of his very last conversation in this case. Chapter 8. The final twist. The Gainesworth Gallery was quiet again. The clamour of yesterday's arrest had subsided. Sir Lawrence Gainesworth was now under guard at Scotland Yard, awaiting formal charges for fraud, theft and murder. Yet Inspector Harold Price remained uneasy. Cases that appeared neatly tied often had loose threads, and Price knew from experience that the smallest, most seemingly insignificant of them could unravel the whole picture. It was that final line in Harcourt's ledger, truth confirmed, that would not leave his mind. Sir Lawrence's confession had explained part of it. Harcourt had uncovered the Madonna and child's true status as a forgery. But the phrasing suggested another truth entirely, one personal enough for Harcourt to note in private. And there was also the matter of the cloaked figure both Alfred and the watchman had seen. Sir Lawrence admitted to meeting Harcourt, but insisted he had worn no cloak. Price intended to find out exactly who had. That afternoon, he requested Evelyn Harcourt's presence in the gallery's small reading room. She arrived in deep mourning black, her veil drawn low, though it did nothing to soften the cool precision in her gaze. "Inspector," she said, settling into a high-backed chair, "if this is about my husband's work, I'm afraid I can't tell you more than I already have." Price poured tea for them both, deliberately unhurried. "Mrs. Harcourt, your husband was a man of principle. He could be, by all accounts, difficult, but he was meticulous. He noted everything, and in his final hours he recorded truth confirmed in his ledger. You wouldn't happen to know what that means?" Her gloved fingers tightened slightly around the teacup. "No," she said evenly. "It sounds like Julian. He liked cryptic remarks, but I can't guess." "You're a painter yourself," Price said. "You'd know if something about a work was familiar." She tilted her head. "Familiar?" "The Madonna and Child, for instance," Price went on, his tone still conversational. "The way the smallest finger of the child's hand is bent inward. An unusual choice, and one that appears, quite coincidentally, in one of your early sketches, a sketch I found in an old exhibition catalogue." For the first time, Evelyn's composure faltered. "That proves nothing." "It proves more than you think," Price said. "It proves Harcourt recognised your hand in the work. Not in the original, but in the forgery, which means you, Mrs. Harcourt, were the one who painted it." Her eyes narrowed, the faintest flicker of satisfaction crossing her face. "Julian did figure it out," she said at last. "He always underestimated me. I was the better artist, you know. He just had the name and the connections." "And when he confronted you," Price prompted. "He laughed," she said, her voice sharpening. "Said he'd have me arrested along with the rest. Do you know what it's like, Inspector, to watch someone else claim all the credit for your work? To be treated as an ornament, not a partner? He didn't care about me. He cared about his precious reputation." Price's gaze was steady. "So you met him in the cloak. Your cloak, after the gala. You argued. You struck him. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. Not at first. I went to persuade him to let me keep quiet. But when I saw the look in his eyes, saw that he would enjoy ruining me, I picked up the nearest thing to hand. The lamp base was heavier than I expected. He fell and I left him there. And Sir Lawrence? Price asked. Oh, he was guilty too, Evelyn said with a shrug. When he found Julian dead, he must have realised what it meant. Better for him to take the blame and control the story. He'd be remembered as the villain, yes, but at least his dealings with the painting would never fully come to light. Men like him think they can direct the narrative. Price studied her in silence for a moment. You've been content to let him hang for your crime. She met his gaze without flinching. He destroyed priceless works for profit. I created something beautiful, even if it was dishonest, which is worse. Price stood slowly. Murder, Mrs. Harcourt, is always worse. At his signal, Wilkes stepped in from the doorway. Evelyn's expression didn't change as she was asked to rise. She handed over her gloves, as though giving up a pair of soiled brushes. As she was led away, she turned back once. You know, Inspector, when people come to see that painting, they'll still admire it. They'll admire me. They just won't know it. Price's reply was cool. They'll know, Mrs. Harcourt. I'll make sure of it. Epilogue. 2 weeks later, the Madonna and Child was removed from the Gainesworth Gallery and placed into secure storage as the courts deliberated its fate. The newspapers revelled in the scandal. Society art patron and widow face trial in sensational murder and forgery case. Inspector Harold Price read the headlines over a quiet breakfast and set them aside. Cases like this rarely brought satisfaction. Too much beauty spoiled by greed. But at least Harcourt's final note, truth confirmed, had been honoured. Both truths, in fact. And that, Price thought, was as close to justice as the art world was likely to get.